I should have known that a house which swallowed its mistress whole would not hesitate to devour me too. That thought came to me on my third night at Ashford Manor, when I woke to the sound of a woman weeping somewhere deep within the walls. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where all mistakes begin, with necessity wearing the mask of opportunity. My name is Leticia Crane, and I was 26 years old when I accepted the position of housekeeper to the Duke of Ashford. 26 and alone in the world, my modest inheritance spent on my mother's final illness, my prospects narrowed to positions I once would have thought beneath my station. But grief and poverty are great levelers, and when the letter arrived from Ashford Manor offering generous wages for managing a household staff in the north, I told myself it was Providence. I told myself many lies in those days. The journey took 3 days by rail and carriage, each mile carrying me farther from the smoky sprawl of London and deeper into a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time. The trees grew sparse and twisted. The sky pressed down like tarnished silver. And when the carriage finally turned up the long drive to Ashford Manor, I felt the first stirring of unease in my chest, cold and certain as a hand upon my heart. The house rose from the moorland, like something carved from shadow and stone. 3 stories of gray granite, narrow windows that caught no light, a great door black as a coffin lid. Ivy clung to the walls in dead brown tangles, and everywhere I looked I saw signs of neglect, of a household slowly succumbing to entropy and silence. The driver would not meet my eyes as he set down my trunk. He touched his cap, climbed back onto his seat, and drove away as though pursued. I stood alone in the gathering dusk, my breath misting an air that already carried the bite of coming winter, and wondered what manner of house required a housekeeper but could not maintain its own grounds. The door opened before I could knock. A thin woman in black regarded me with eyes like chips of coal. Mrs. Blackwood, the senior housekeeper, though I would not learn until later that she had been trying to leave this position for months, and my arrival was her long-awaited deliverance. She led me through halls that smelled of beeswax and something else, something I could not name. Decay, perhaps. Old grief. The house was grand in the way of old northern estates, all dark wood and darker paintings, but there was a wrongness to it, a sense of held breath, of secrets pressed between the walls like flowers in a book. We passed only 2 other servants, a maid who would not look at me, a footman who crossed himself when he thought I could not see. Mrs. Blackwood brought me to a small parlor where a fire burned low in the grate. She offered me tea I did not want, and information I needed desperately. The Duke, she said, was in residence. He rarely left the manor. He rarely received guests. The household staff had dwindled from 20 to 6 over the past year. No one would say why, but I could see the answer in the tight line of her mouth, in the way her hands shook as she poured the tea. And then she told me about Lady Rosalind, the Duke's first wife, married 5 years ago in what society had called the match of the season. Beautiful, accomplished, beloved by all who knew her. She had disappeared 3 winters past, vanished from her own bedchamber in the middle of a snowstorm. Some said she had run away. Others whispered darker theories. Her body was never found. The Duke had searched for weeks, had offered rewards, had questioned every soul for miles. But Ashford Manor had kept its secret, and Lady Rosalind remained among the missing. The Duke, Mrs. Blackwood said, had not been the same since. He kept to his study and his library. He spoke little. He saw no one, and he forbade any mention of his wife's name within these walls. I should have left then. I should have invented an excuse, a sick relation, a prior commitment. But I thought of my empty purse and my empty rooms in London, and I told myself that every grand house has its tragedies, its ghost stories whispered by servants to pass the long winter nights. I told myself I was too sensible to be frightened by shadows and rumors. I met the Duke that evening in the library where he spent most of his hours. Mrs. Blackwood led me there with obvious reluctance, knocked twice, and fled before the door even opened. He stood with his back to the fire, a tall figure in black, and for a moment I could see only his silhouette against the flames. Then he stepped forward, and I saw his face. Gideon Ashford was perhaps 35, though grief had added years to his features. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome before sorrow carved it into something harder, more remote, dark hair touched with premature silver, eyes the color of winter seas, a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. He regarded me with the detached interest one might show a new piece of furniture. "Miss Crane," he said. His voice was low, carefully controlled. "You come with excellent references. I trust Mrs. Blackwood has explained the particulars of the position." "She has, Your Grace," I replied, and was pleased to hear my own voice steady. "The household runs on a minimal staff. You will oversee what remains. I require order, discretion, and silence. I do not entertain. I do not receive callers. You will find the work straightforward provided you do not ask questions or indulge in speculation." His eyes held mine, and I saw something flicker in their depths. A warning, perhaps, or a plea. "I understand," I said, though I understood nothing. He nodded once, a curt dismissal, and turned back to the fire. I was halfway to the door when he spoke again. "The winter here is harsh, Miss Crane. The roads become impassable. Supplies must be laid in carefully. Mrs. Blackwood will show you the accounts. See to it that we do not run short." There was something in his tone, a tension I could not name, as though he knew what was coming, as though he had seen this winter before, in dreams or memory. "I will, Your Grace," I said. He did not answer. He stood before the fire, like a man at a funeral, and I left him there, alone with whatever ghosts he kept. That night I lay in my narrow bed in the housekeeper's room and listened to the old house settle around me. Wind rattled the windows, floorboards creaked overhead, and somewhere, very faint, I thought I heard the sound of a door closing, though I knew no one had passed in the hall. I told myself it was only the wind, only the age of the place, only my own nerves, stretched thin by travel and strangeness. But when I finally slept, I dreamed of a woman in white, standing at the end of a long corridor, her hair unbound, her face in shadow. She raised one hand, beckoning, and though I could not see her features, I knew with terrible certainty that she was weeping. I woke with my heart racing and found the room grown cold as a tomb. My breath misted in the air. Frost had formed on the inside of the window, delicate as lace, and outside, silent and soft as a whispered secret, the first snow had begun to fall. The snow did not stop falling for 3 days, and by then, we were already prisoners. I understood this on the morning of the 4th day, when I stood at the library window and saw nothing but white stretching to the horizon, drifts piled higher than a man's head against the walls, the road to the village erased as completely as if it had never existed. The world beyond Ashford Manor had vanished, leaving only this house, these stones, these few souls trapped together in the gathering cold. Mrs. Blackwood left on the 2nd day, before the worst of it hit. She had family in the south, she said, a sister who needed her. She would not meet my eyes when she gave her excuses. She pressed the household keys into my hand with something that looked like pity, climbed into the carriage that had come for her, and did not look back as the horses pulled away through the thickening snow. I watched her go and felt the weight of the keys like an anchor in my palm. The remaining staff whispered among themselves. Martha, the young maid, had grown pale and jumpy, starting at every sound. Thomas, the footman, spent his hours at the windows, watching the snow pile higher, his jaw tight with unspoken worry. Cook, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Brennan, kept her kitchen door locked and would only emerge to deliver meals, her face set in grim lines. And the Duke moved through it all like a ghost himself, silent and distant. His presence felt more than seen. I threw myself into work because work was all I knew. I inventoried the cellars and found our stores adequate, but not generous. I checked the firewood and ordered it rationed. I went through the accounts and realized with growing unease that Mrs. Blackwood had been careless, that supplies I had assumed ordered were not, that the winter ahead would be leaner than anyone had planned. When I brought this to the Duke's attention, he received the news with no visible reaction. "We will manage, Miss Crane," he said, and returned his attention to the book before him. "But, Your Grace, the roads are impassable. We cannot rely on deliveries. If the winter is long—" "The winter is always long," he interrupted, his voice quiet but final. "We will manage because we must. That is the way of this house." I wanted to argue, to press the point, but something in his face stopped me. A weariness so deep it seemed to emanate from his very bones. He looked like a man who had already survived the unsurvivable and expected nothing better from the world. I left him there and went about my duties with a growing sense of dread I could not name. The disturbances began that night. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall outside my door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the whisper of something dragging across the floor. I lay frozen in my bed, my heart hammering, listening to those footsteps pass my door and continue down the hall, fading into silence. In the morning, I told myself it had been a dream, but when I ventured into the corridor, I found frost on the floorboards where something had walked, a trail of ice crystals leading down the hall and ending abruptly at the wall. I mentioned it to no one. What would I say? That I believed the house was haunted? That I heard the ghost of Lady Rosalind walking the halls at night? They would think me mad or foolish, and I could not afford to be either. But the disturbances continued. Doors that I locked would be found standing open. Candles would gutter and die in rooms with no draft. And always, always, the sense of being watched, of eyes following me through the shadows. Martha saw her first. She came to me on the 5th morning, trembling and tearful, and begged to be released from her duties. "I saw her, Miss Crane," the girl whispered, clutching my arm. "Last night, in the upper hall. A lady in white, with long dark hair. She was standing at the window, looking out at the snow. And when I called to her, she turned and I saw her face. The girl's voice broke. She was weeping, Miss Crane. Tears like ice on her cheeks. And she looked so sad, so terribly sad. And then she was gone. Just gone. As though she had never been. I wanted to comfort the girl, to tell her it was only shadows and nerves, but I had heard those footsteps. I had seen that frost, and something in me knew, with cold certainty, that Martha spoke the truth. I gave her the rest of the day to compose herself and went to find the Duke. He was in the music room, standing before the grand piano that no one had played in years. His hand rested on the closed lid, his expression distant, lost in some memory I could not reach. "Your Grace," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and for a moment I saw something raw in his face before the mask of control descended. "Miss Crane, you have the look of someone bearing bad news." I hesitated, weighing my words. "One of the staff has been frightened by what she believes to be a supernatural occurrence. I thought you should know." His expression did not change, but I saw his hand tighten on the piano lid. "What did she see?" I told him. He listened in silence, his face carved from stone. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice so low I almost did not hear. "My wife played this piano. Every evening before dinner. Chopin, mostly. She loved Chopin." He opened the lid, pressed a single key. The note rang out, pure and mournful, and seemed to hang in the air long after it should have faded. I have not heard it played since the night she disappeared. There was such pain in his voice, such carefully contained anguish, that I felt my throat tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I am sorry, Your Grace." He closed the lid with a soft thud. His eyes met mine, and I saw in them a grief so profound it took my breath away. "Do you believe in ghosts, Miss Crane?" The question caught me off guard. I thought of those footsteps, that frost, the weeping I had heard in the walls. "I do not know," I said honestly. "I believe there are things we do not understand, mysteries beyond our comprehension." He smiled then, a bitter twist of his mouth. How diplomatic. "But I will tell you what I believe. I believe this house remembers. I believe stone and wood can hold sorrow the way earth holds water. And I believe my wife has never truly left these halls." "Why would she stay?" I asked, before I could stop myself. His gaze grew distant. "Because she is trapped. Because there are questions that need answering. Because the dead do not rest easy when they have been wronged." The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. "Your Grace, what happened to Lady Rosalind?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I thought he would refuse to answer, would order me from the room and forbid me to speak of this again. But instead, he walked to the window, pressed his hand against the cold glass, and spoke into the silence. I do not know. That is the torment of it, Miss Crane. I do not know. That night, the temperature dropped so severely that ice formed on the inside of every window in the house. We gathered what we could of blankets and moved the servants to rooms closer to the kitchen fires. The Duke I did not see. He had retreated to his study and locked the door. I sat alone in the housekeeper's parlor, wrapped in shawls, listening to the wind scream around the eaves. And sometime past midnight, I heard it. Music, faint, delicate, achingly beautiful. Chopin, floating through the house like a memory-made sound. I rose and followed it through the darkened halls, my candle flame dancing, my breath clouding in the frozen air. The music grew louder, clearer, drawing me toward the music room. The door stood open. Moonlight spilled through the windows, cold and blue. And there, at the piano, sat a figure in white. She played with her back to me, her long dark hair unbound down her back, her fingers moving over the keys with impossible grace. The music swelled and sighed, a nocturne full of longing and loss. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, and then, as though sensing my presence, she stopped. Slowly, she turned. I saw her face in the moonlight, beautiful and terrible, young and ageless, her eyes dark hollows, her lips blue as if with cold. And when she spoke, her voice was like wind through empty rooms. "Find it," she whispered. "Find what he hides. Only then can I rest." I tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but my voice would not come. I stood there, trembling, as she rose from the piano bench and drifted toward me. She reached out one pale hand, and I felt the cold radiating from her like winter itself. Her fingers brushed my cheek, ice against skin, and I gasped at the shock of it. "The hidden passage," she breathed. "Behind the books. Find it before the hunger takes you all." And then she was gone, dissolved into moonlight and shadow, leaving only the fading echo of music and the cold, cold touch of her hand upon my face. I do not know how long I stood there, shaking, my mind struggling to accept what I had seen. But when I finally turned to leave, I saw him, the Duke, standing in the hall behind me, his face white as death, his eyes fixed on the empty piano bench. "You saw her," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I whispered. He closed his eyes, swayed slightly, and for a moment I thought he might fall. I moved to steady him, my hand on his arm, and felt him trembling beneath my touch. "Your Grace, what is happening in this house?" When he opened his eyes, they were full of such despair that my heart broke for him. "I do not know," he said, "but I fear we are all running out of time to find out." The library held 3,000 books, and somewhere behind them lay the secret that might save us all. I understood this with desperate clarity as I stood before the towering shelves the morning after my encounter with Lady Rosalind's ghost. The Duke had not slept. I could see it in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the rigid set of his shoulders as he moved methodically along the walls, running his hands over the wooden panels, searching for hollow spaces, hidden mechanisms, anything that might reveal the passage his dead wife had spoken of. We had not discussed what I had seen, what we had both seen. Some truths are too strange for daylight conversation, too fragile to survive being spoken aloud. But an understanding had formed between us in that frozen moment, a wordless acknowledgement that we were bound together now, whether by supernatural forces or simple necessity. The supplies were running low. Mrs. Brennan had come to me that morning, her usual stoicism cracked by worry. 2 weeks of provisions left, perhaps 3 if we rationed carefully. The snow showed no signs of stopping. And yesterday, when Thomas had tried to dig his way to the old ice house, he had made it less than 10 feet before the cold drove him back, his hands blue with frostbite. We were starving slowly, freezing by degrees, and our only hope lay in the words of a ghost. I worked beside the Duke in silence, pulling books from their shelves, checking behind them for gaps or seams. The library smelled of old leather and dust, and occasionally I would catch the faint scent of lavender. Lady Rosalind's perfume, perhaps, a ghostly trace that made the hair rise on my neck. Hours passed. The light changed from gray to grayer. My arms ached from reaching, my eyes burned from straining in the dim light. And still, we found nothing. It was the Duke who finally broke the silence. "She loved this room," he said quietly, not looking at me. She would spend entire afternoons here, reading by the window, poetry mostly. She had a particular fondness for the romantics. He ran his hand along a shelf of Blake and Wordsworth, his touch almost tender. I should have paid more attention, should have listened when she tried to tell me she was unhappy. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "you are not responsible for what happened." He turned to me then, and I saw something raw and wounded in his face. "Am I not? She was my wife, Miss Crane. My responsibility, my charge, and I failed her utterly." There was such pain in his voice that I moved toward him without thinking, my hand reaching for his arm in a gesture of comfort I had no right to offer. He looked down at my hand, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed. "You are kind," he said softly, "kinder than I deserve." Our eyes met, and something passed between us, a current of understanding, of shared grief and fear, and something else, something I dared not name. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us, standing close in the dusty light, and I felt a pull toward him that had nothing to do with duty or circumstance. Then Martha's scream shattered the moment. We ran, the Duke ahead of me, racing through the corridors toward the sound. We found her in the upper hallway, collapsed against the wall, pointing with a shaking hand at the portrait that hung there, Lady Rosalind's portrait, life-sized, painted in the first year of her marriage. She wore a gown of ivory silk, pearls at her throat, her dark hair elaborately dressed, but it was her eyes that caught and held, painted with such skill they seemed to follow the viewer, alive with intelligence and something else, something almost like warning. She moved, Martha sobbed. I saw her move. Her eyes, they looked right at me, and she raised her hand and pointed. The Duke went very still, his gaze fixed on the portrait, and I saw the color drain from his face. "Where did she point, Martha?" I asked gently. The girl lifted a trembling hand. There, at the wall behind her, at the panel beneath the window. The Duke and I exchanged a glance. Without a word, we crossed to the place Martha had indicated. It looked like all the other panels, dark wood carved with simple molding, nothing to distinguish it from a dozen others. But when the Duke pressed his hand against it, I heard a soft click. The panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. The Duke stepped back, his breathing harsh. I moved to the opening, peering into the shadows, and felt cold air rise from below, carrying with it the smell of earth and stone and something else, something sweet and sickly that made my stomach turn. "We need light," the Duke said, his voice tight. Thomas brought lamps. The Duke took one, I took another, and together we stood at the threshold of that dark passage. Martha refused to follow, and I could not blame her. Even Thomas looked pale and uncertain. The Duke looked at me. "You do not have to come, Miss Crane. This is not your burden." But it was. Whatever lay in that darkness, whatever secrets this house held, I was bound to them now. Bound by the ghost who had touched my face with frozen fingers, bound by the hunger that gnawed at us all, bound most of all by the man who stood beside me, waiting for my answer. "I go where you go," I said. Something flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or fear. We descended. The passage was narrow, the walls close, the steps uneven and treacherous. Our lamps threw wild shadows that danced and leaped. The air grew colder with each step, until our breath came in clouds and frost began to form on the stone. Down and down we went, deeper than I thought possible, until I realized we must be below the cellars, below the foundations themselves, in some ancient part of the house that predated the current structure. The passage opened into a chamber. It was circular, perhaps 20 feet across, the walls rough-hewn stone. In the center stood a table, and on the table lay the remains of provisions. Cured meats, wheels of cheese, sealed jars and casks, enough to feed a household for months. A cache, I breathed. Lady Rosalind knew. She must have discovered it. But the Duke was not looking at the provisions. His eyes were fixed on the far wall, where something pale caught the lamplight. He crossed to it slowly, as though moving through deep water, and I followed. It was a dress, laid out carefully on the stone floor, arms arranged, skirts spread. An ivory gown, now yellowed with age and damp, and beside it, a pair of pearl earrings, a wedding ring, a comb of tortoiseshell. The things she wore the night she disappeared. The Duke fell to his knees beside them, his lamp trembling in his hand. He reached out to touch the fabric, then drew back as if burned. "She was here," he whispered. "She came here, and she never left." I felt my throat close with pity and horror. "But where is she now? Where is her body?" He shook his head, unable to speak. And then I saw it. A second opening in the wall, smaller than the first, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I moved toward it, holding my lamp high. The passage beyond was little more than a crack in the rock, twisting away into darkness. "Your Grace," I called softly, "there is another way." He rose and came to stand beside me. Together we peered into that narrow space. "She must have gone through," he said, "trying to find a way out, trying to escape." "Escape what?" I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. "Me?" he said, his voice breaking. "She was trying to escape me." The anguish in his words tore at my heart. I turned to him, saw tears on his face, the first tears I had witnessed from this man who held himself so rigidly controlled. "Your Grace," I began, but he cut me off. "Gideon," he said roughly. "My name is Gideon, and you should know the truth, Miss Crane. You should know what manner of man you have bound yourself to." He drew a shaking breath, his eyes fixed on that abandoned dress. "We quarreled the night she disappeared. About money, about the estate, about her desire to leave this place and my refusal to consider it. I was cruel. I said things I can never take back, and she fled from me, fled into the storm, and I let her go. I let my pride and my anger keep me from following until it was too late." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I drove her to it, Miss Crane. Whatever happened to her, wherever she is now, it is my doing, my sin." I stood there, lamp in hand, looking at this broken man who had carried such guilt for so long it had become part of him, inseparable from his very bones. And I made a choice. I set down my lamp and took his face in my hands, forcing him to meet my eyes. "Then we find her," I said. "We follow this passage to wherever it leads, and we bring her home. We give her the peace she deserves and the answers she seeks. And then, Gideon, you must learn to forgive yourself." He stared at me, his eyes searching mine, and I saw something kindle there, something like hope struggling to catch flame. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this? You owe me nothing." "Because I cannot bear to watch you suffer," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "Because in these few short days you have become more to me than a master or an employer. Because when I look at you, I see not a man who drove his wife away, but a man who loved deeply and lost terribly and deserves a second chance at peace." The truth hung between us, stark and undeniable. His hand came up to cover mine where it rested against his cheek, and the touch sent warmth flooding through me despite the cold. "Leticia," he breathed, my name on his lips a revelation. Then the ground beneath us trembled, stone groaned, and from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond, we heard a sound that froze the blood in our veins. A voice, thin and distant and unmistakably human, calling for help. Lady Rosalind was not dead, and she was still trapped somewhere in the darkness, waiting to be found. She was alive, and that changed everything. Gideon moved first, squeezing through that narrow opening in the rock with a desperation that bordered on violence. I followed close behind, my lamp held high, my heart hammering against my ribs. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders, the stone cold and damp against my hands as I pushed forward into darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. The voice came again, stronger now, echoing strangely through the twisting corridor. "Help me, please, someone help me." It was a woman's voice, weak with exhaustion or illness, but unmistakably human. Not a ghost, not a spirit. A living woman, trapped in these ancient passages beneath Ashford Manor. The tunnel opened suddenly into a wider space, and I stumbled out behind Gideon, raising my lamp to see what lay before us. It was a natural cavern, the walls glittering with moisture, stalactites hanging from the ceiling like frozen tears, and there, huddled against the far wall, wrapped in what looked like moth-eaten blankets, was a woman. She shielded her eyes from our lamplight, turning her face away. Her hair hung in tangled dark masses around her shoulders. Her dress, once fine, was torn and filthy. But even in that condition, even after 3 years in darkness, I could see the resemblance to the portrait that hung in the upper hall. Rosalind, Gideon breathed. And the name was a prayer and a curse and a question all at once. He crossed to her in 3 strides, fell to his knees beside her, reaching for her with shaking hands. But she flinched away from his touch, pressing herself harder against the stone wall. "No," she whispered. "No, please, not again." The words struck him like a physical blow. He drew back, his face stricken. "Rosalind, it is me. It is Gideon. You are safe now. We have found you." But she only shook her head, her eyes wild and unfocused. She looked past him, through him, as though seeing something else entirely. I moved closer, setting my lamp down carefully. "Gideon," I said softly, "she is not well. Let me try." He nodded mutely and moved aside. I knelt before Lady Rosalind, keeping my movements slow and gentle. "My name is Leticia Crane," I said, in the calmest voice I could manage. "I am the new housekeeper at the manor. We have come to help you. Can you tell me your name?" She looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. "Rosalind," she whispered. "I am Rosalind Ashford. I am the Duchess. I must remember. I must not forget." The words had the quality of something repeated often, a mantra against madness. "Good," I said. "Yes, you are the Duchess, and we are going to take you home. Can you stand?" She tried, but her legs would not hold her. Gideon caught her before she fell, and this time she did not flinch away. She looked up at him, and I saw confusion war with something else in her face. "Gideon?" she said uncertainly. "Is it truly you?" His voice broke. "Yes. God help me. Yes." She raised one trembling hand to touch his face, as though assuring herself he was real. "I thought I would die here," she said. "I thought no one would ever find me." "What happened?" I asked gently. "How did you come to be here?" She closed her eyes, and tears slipped down her hollow cheeks. "The night of the storm. We quarreled. I was so angry, so hurt by the things he said. I ran from him, ran through the house, not knowing where I was going. I found the passage by accident, stumbled into it thinking it led outside, but it only led deeper, and when I tried to turn back, the panel had closed. I could not find the mechanism to open it from inside." Her breath came in shuddering gasps. "I walked for hours in the darkness, searching for another way out. I found this cavern. I found the old provisions someone had stored here long ago, and I waited. Days became weeks, weeks became months. I lost track of time, lost track of everything, except the need to survive." She looked at Gideon, with eyes full of terrible knowledge. "I heard you searching, through the walls, through the stone. I heard you calling my name. I screamed until my voice gave out, but the rock was too thick. You could not hear me." Gideon made a sound like a wounded animal. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice raw. "Rosalind, I am so desperately sorry." But she was not finished. "I hated you," she said simply. "For months I hated you. Blamed you for the quarrel, for not finding me, for leaving me here to rot. But then the hate burned itself out, and I was left with only the truth." "What truth?" he asked. "That I was a fool, that I ran from you instead of facing our problems, that I let my pride trap me here as surely as any locked door, and that despite everything, despite all the pain and anger, I still loved you." The confession hung in the cold air between them. Gideon stared at her, disbelief and hope warring on his face. "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "I mourned you as dead, and all this time, you were here, suffering, while I lived in comfort above." "We both suffered," she said. "We both paid for our mistakes. I watched them, these 2 broken people finding their way back to each other across a gulf of pain and misunderstanding, and felt my heart clench with a complicated mixture of relief and something dangerously close to envy." "We must get her to warmth and food," I said, breaking the moment. "She needs medical attention." Gideon nodded, gathering his wife carefully in his arms. She was so light, so frail, a ghost made flesh. He carried her toward the narrow passage, and I followed with the lamps, my mind racing. Lady Rosalind was alive. The mystery was solved. The ghost I had seen, the apparition that played Chopin and left frost on the floors, had not been her spirit, but something else. A manifestation of the house's memory, perhaps, or my own mind trying to make sense of what it could not understand. Or perhaps both. Perhaps the house truly did remember its mistress, and that memory had taken form to guide us to the truth. We emerged into the chamber with the provisions. Thomas and Martha had brought blankets and warm bricks, had built up the fire in the lamp brackets along the wall. They gasped when they saw who Gideon carried, crossing themselves and murmuring prayers. We made a makeshift bed from blankets and got Rosalind settled near the warmth. I brought her water, a little broth that Mrs. Brennan had somehow conjured. She drank slowly, her hands shaking, her eyes closing between sips. "How did you survive?" I asked. 3 years on nothing but preserved food and water from the stone. "There is an underground spring," she said. I could hear it. And the old provisions, they were enough. Barely, but enough. She looked around the chamber with something like wonder. I learned every inch of these passages, mapped them in my mind. There are chambers all through the foundations, some older than the house itself, secret ways in and out. This place has more secrets than either of us ever knew. She looked at Gideon, who sat beside her, his hand clasping hers as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. "I forgive you," she said softly, "for the quarrel, for the cruel words. I forgive you, Gideon. And I hope someday you can forgive me for running." His answer was to bow his head over her hand and weep. I turned away, giving them privacy, and found myself looking at the opening we had come through, at the darkness beyond. And standing in that darkness, barely visible in the lamplight, was a figure in white. I froze. The apparition stood watching, her face sad and beautiful, her eyes meeting mine across the distance. And as I stared, she smiled, a small, peaceful smile, and began to fade. "Thank you," I heard, though whether the words were spoken or simply felt, I could not say. And then she was gone, dissolved into shadow and memory, her purpose fulfilled. Lady Rosalind slept, exhausted by her ordeal. Gideon sat vigil beside her, unwilling to leave her side even for a moment. The servants began carrying up provisions from the cache, enough to see us through to spring. I stood alone at the entrance to the passages, looking into the darkness that had held such secrets, such suffering, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. Gideon stood beside me, his face haggard, but at peace for the first time since I had met him. "Thank you," he said simply. "Without you, I would never have found her. Without your courage and your kindness, she would have died here alone." "I was simply doing my duty," I said, but the words rang hollow. "No," he said, "you were being yourself, compassionate, brave, true. You gave me hope when I had none. You made me believe in second chances." He took my hand, raised it to his lips, and I felt the warmth of his kiss like a brand. "What happens now?" I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. "Now I care for my wife," he said. "I help her heal. I rebuild what we once had, if such a thing is possible." "Of course," I said. "That is as it should be." But his eyes held mine, and I saw in them a regret that mirrored my own. "Leticia," he said, and my name on his lips still sent shivers through me. "In another life, in another time, if things had been different." I pressed my fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Do not say it," I whispered. "Some words, once spoken, can never be taken back. Let us keep this as it is. This moment, this understanding. Let that be enough." He nodded slowly, though his hand tightened on mine. "You will stay?" he asked. "Until spring at least?" "I will stay," I promised. And I kept that promise through the long weeks as Lady Rosalind slowly recovered, as the snow finally melted, as spring came late but certain to the moors. But I knew even then that come spring I would have to leave Ashford Manor and the impossible love I had found within its walls. I knew it was time to leave when the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow. Spring came late to Ashford Manor that year, arriving in fits and starts, the sun breaking through clouds only to retreat again behind grey. But it came, as it always does, persistent and patient, melting the drifts that had held us prisoner, opening the roads, bringing the world back to a house that had existed too long in isolation. Lady Rosalind recovered slowly. The physician from the village, summoned as soon as the roads cleared, declared her survival a miracle. 3 years in darkness and cold should have killed her, or at the very least broken her mind beyond repair. But Rosalind was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. Day by day, she grew steadier, her voice stronger, her eyes clearer. I watched her walk the halls she had been torn from, touch the things she had thought never to see again. I watched Gideon hover near her, attentive and tender, learning how to be her husband again after years of being her mourner. And I felt my heart break a little more each day, because what I had found in those dark winter months was not mine to keep. Gideon and I maintained a careful distance. We spoke when necessary, always with formality, always with witnesses. But sometimes our eyes would meet across a room, and in that glance I would see everything we could not say, the recognition of what might have been, the acknowledgement of a love that had bloomed in crisis and could not survive in daylight. It was Rosalind who finally addressed what we all knew, but no one would speak. She called me to the music room one afternoon in early April. The windows stood open, letting in air that smelled of earth and growing things. She sat at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, not playing but remembering. "Sit with me, Miss Crane," she said gently. I sat, my hands folded in my lap, my spine straight. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in her eyes a wisdom born of suffering. "You saved my life," she said. "You and Gideon both. I can never repay that debt. Your Grace, there is no debt," I began. But she held up a hand. "Please, let me speak. I have spent 3 years in darkness with nothing but my thoughts for company. I learned many things in that time. I learned what matters and what does not. I learned to see clearly, without the distractions of society and expectation." She turned to face me fully. "I see how he looks at you, and I see how you look at him." My breath caught. I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Your Grace, I assure you." She smiled, sad and knowing. "You assure me of nothing, because there is nothing to assure. I am not blind, Miss Crane, nor am I cruel. What grew between you during those dark months, I understand it. How could I not? You faced death together. You comforted each other. You found in each other what I could not give him from my prison of stone." Tears stung my eyes. "I am so sorry," I whispered. "For what? For being human? For caring for a good man who needed care? There is no sin in that, Leticia. May I call you Leticia?" I nodded, unable to speak. "Here is what I have learned," she continued. "Love is not a finite thing. The heart does not divide, it multiplies. Gideon can love us both, in different ways, for different reasons, and that does not diminish what he feels for either of us." She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "But I also know this. He is my husband. We made vows before God and witnesses, and despite all the pain, despite the mistakes and the suffering, I still love him. I want to rebuild what we had. I want to try." "As you should," I said, forcing the words past the tightness in my throat. "As you must." "Yes," she said. "But that means you cannot stay, Leticia. You know this as well as I do. Your presence here would be a constant reminder of what cannot be. It would poison any chance we have of healing." "I know," I said. "I have already made arrangements. There is a position in London, with a family who needs a governess. I leave at the end of the week." She nodded slowly. "That is wise. That is right. But know this, Leticia Crane. You are a remarkable woman. You are brave and kind and true. And whatever comes next for you, I believe you will find happiness. Real happiness, not the shadow of it." She released my hand and turned back to the piano. Her fingers found the keys, and the opening notes of a Chopin nocturne filled the room. The same piece I had heard the ghost play all those weeks ago. I sat and listened, tears streaming down my face, and let the music say what words could not. My last days at Ashford Manor passed in a blur of packing and farewells. Martha cried and pressed a handkerchief she had embroidered into my hands. Mrs. Brennan gave me a basket of provisions for the journey. Thomas helped load my trunk onto the carriage that would take me to the station. I saved Gideon for last. I found him in the library, standing before the shelves that had hidden the passage to salvation. He turned when I entered, and I saw the same grief in his face that I felt in my heart. "So you are truly going," he said. "I must." He crossed to me, stopping just close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, smell the familiar scent of soap and wool and something uniquely his. "I will never forget you, Leticia," he said. "What you did for us, for me, it changed everything." "And I will never forget you," I replied. "You taught me that even in the darkest winter, spring will come, that love can survive the impossible, that second chances are real." He took my hand, raised it to his lips, held it there for a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. "If things were different, they are not," I said gently. "And we must accept what is, not what might have been." He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You deserve happiness, Leticia. Promise me you will find it." "I will try," I said. "And you must promise me the same. Build your life again with Rosalind. Learn to forgive yourself. Let go of the guilt you have carried for so long." "I promise," he said. We stood there, hands clasped, two people who had found each other in darkness and must now part in the light. And then, because I could not bear another moment, I pulled my hand free, turned, and walked away. I did not look back. If I had, my resolve would have shattered. The carriage carried me down the long drive, past the moors greening with spring, past the village where life continued in its steady rhythm. And as Ashford Manor disappeared behind me, I felt something shift inside my chest, not breaking, but changing. The sharp pain of loss giving way to something gentler, something that might one day become peace. I arrived in London on a wet Tuesday afternoon and presented myself at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Edmund Hartley, who needed a governess for their daughters. They were kind people, their children bright and eager. The work was good, the wages fair, the room they gave me clean and comfortable. But at night, lying in my narrow bed, I would think of a grey stone manor on the northern moors. I would think of a man with winter eyes and a wounded heart. I would think of ghosts and secrets and a love that had bloomed in darkness and could not survive the dawn. And I would tell myself that this was enough, this quiet life, this useful work, this peace I had earned through suffering. I told myself that what I had experienced at Ashford Manor was a gift, not a tragedy, that I had been changed by it, made stronger, made wiser. Most days, I almost believed it. A year passed, then another. I received occasional news of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford through society columns and gossip. They had been seen at a ball in Edinburgh. They had hosted a dinner for local gentry. They seemed, by all accounts, to have found their way back to each other. I was glad for them. Truly I was. Their happiness did not diminish my pain, but it gave it purpose. I had helped save something worth saving. That had to be enough. Then, on a cold November evening in my 3rd year in London, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the seal that of Ashford Manor. My hands shook as I opened it. It was from Rosalind. She wrote to tell me that she and Gideon had welcomed a son, born healthy and strong in the summer. They had named him Thomas, after the footman who had stayed loyal through the dark winter. They were happy, she said. Not perfectly, not without scars, but genuinely happy. And then, at the end of the letter, she had written something that made me put my hand to my mouth to hold back a sob. "You were right, Leticia. Spring did come, but it was your courage in that terrible winter that made our spring possible. We will never forget you. We will never stop being grateful. And we hope, wherever you are, that you have found your own spring, your own happiness." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small box where I kept my most precious things. The embroidered handkerchief from Martha, a pressed flower from the moors, a small stone I had picked up from the hidden passage, smooth and cold and real, relics of a winter that had changed everything. I did not write back. There was nothing more to say. They had their life. I had mine. We had all survived, all found a way forward. That was grace enough. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when frost formed patterns on my window, I would think I heard music. Chopin, distant and sweet, drifting through the darkness, and I would smile, remembering a ghost who had loved enough to transcend death, a man who had loved enough to forgive himself, and a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest love is knowing when to let go. The winter at Ashford Manor had taught me many things. It had taught me about courage and sacrifice, about the strength that comes from facing what we fear most, about the way love can grow in the darkest places, and how sometimes the most profound act of love is to step back into the light alone. I made my peace with it. I built a life that had meaning and purpose. I found contentment, if not passion, peace, if not joy. And on the first day of every spring, when the crocuses pushed through the thawing earth, I would think of a gray manor on the moors, and I would whisper a prayer of gratitude for the winter that had broken my heart and remade my soul. Some loves are not meant to be lived, only to be survived. And in surviving them, we become who we were always meant to be. I survived. I became. And that, in the end, was enough.